Good morning, Scar Island lovers. this is Beth here to read chapter 5, reacquaint you with chapter 4, what's happened. Um, at the end, remember what happened? It was all about breakfast and how at first it didn't look like he was going to get any, and he had to make it for the people in charge, and he was starving. But his good old friend, what was his name? The one with the speech issue was named Colin. Colin was a kleptomaniac and stole himself some breakfast, so he was able to give our main character Jonathan a his oatmeal. Um, and then you remember that the admiral was reminding him about how awful he was. He said, "You, Jonathan Grisby, you do deserve to be here, don't you?" He had those obsidian eyes. Remember what obsidian was? It said in the next paragraph, actually, they were black. It said, and he had reptilian slits. If you notice what a crocodile looks like, or they have these little narrow eyes looking at him. He says, "You deserve." This guy's got great adjectives and adverbs to make you really see and hear the place where we are. Okay, that's enough of the prelude to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is called Morning Muster. Have you mustered with your family this morning? Have you got together? I hope so. Had some breakfast. It's 10 of 9. Anyway, here we go. Morning muster. It was morning muster time. The boys were marched outside into the drizzly gray courtyard. A light rain was falling and bunched up piles of clouds blackened the sky. Thunder rumbled in the not too far distance. The boys trudged over to a line of small stone blocks on the ground, each about the size of a brick and spaced a few steps apart from one another. Without a word, each boy stepped up and squeezed his foot onto one, found his balance, and then stood at shaky attention. Jonathan took a breath and did the same, standing on the brick. The block was just wide enough for both feet to fit on it, pressed tight together. The tips of his toes and the black backs of his heels hung over the front and back. He wobbled and steadied himself and then looked up. The courtyard was the size of a basketball court. He'd walked through it briefly his first day, following Mr. Vander in his handcuffs. But he'd been too tired and scared then to look close or notice much. He could see to his right the steep arched doorway closed and locked that led to the watery stairs he'd come in on. There were doorways on each wall that he could see all closed. The floor and the walls of the courtyard were made of the same gray blocks of stone that the rest of the building was made of. Green moss grew between the cracks in places. The walls stretched high above them, 30 or 40 feet, blocking out most of the sky and a good deal of the light. The part of the sky that was visible was getting darker and more ominous by the second. Ominous, it's a good word, very good word. You can imagine what ominous is. The sky's getting darker and more ominous. There was a flash of lightning. The courtyard stone block ground was flat and covered with so many big puddles that it was nearly one shallow lake. The surface of the puddles were pocked and pecked by more falling rain. Shifting snaps of wind whistled through the courtyard. And the boys, shifting snaps of wind whistled around the courtyard, chilling the boys and blowing Jonathan's hair and into his eyes. The door to their left swung open, and the whole group of men from breakfast slumped out with the admiral at the front, the ridiculous wide hat roughly triangular sat on his head, and the sword still swung at his side. The last two men in line came up sideways, grunting and holding the sinner's sorrow between them. They plocked it down with a wet thud on the stones before the boys. Jonathan looked at the kneeler's sharp, hard edge and winced. The men formed a line facing the boys. They stood in an oily black puddle with their boots and shoulders touching. Jonathan counted them. 8 adults. The Admiral stood in the center of the line, his arms at his sides and his chin held regally high. Mr. Warwick, standing on one end of the line, held the wooden handle of a big brass bell in his hand. When the 2 men who'd carried the sinner's sorrow joined the line, he rang the bell. Oh, I should get my bell. I have a great bell. The dull metal clanging bounced around the grim gray walls and up the storm-choked sky. "Morning muster, November the 5th, Mr. Warwick collared. The man on the other end of the line pulled some papers out of his coat pocket and held them with both hands in the wet wind. "James Amherst," he shouted. "Here, sir, content and well cared for, sir," a boy Jonathan hadn't met yet shouted back. "David Okada, here, sir, content and well cared for, sir." "Benedict Fellows, here, sir," the kid called Benny answered. His voice sounded greasy even when he was shouting through a rainstorm. "Content and well cared for, sir." Jonathan Grisby. Jonathan gulped and looked around. He almost stumbled off the block, but caught himself. "Here, sir," he called. His voice sounded thin and meek and was nearly lost in the wind-blown rain. "Content and well cared for, sir." The Admiral smirked. "Colin Kerrigan." "Here, sir." Colin didn't shout. Jonathan wasn't sure he could shout, but he did speak it more than a shy whisper. "Content and well cared for, sir." All the boys were called, 16 in all, and each gave same answer. When they were done, the man folded the papers and slipped them back in the coat. 16 charges, sir, all present, and all report being content and well cared for, sir." The Admiral grimaced and wrinkled his nose. "Thank you, Mr. Washburn. Put it in your report." The Admiral stepped forward. He took a few soggy steps toward the line of boys, his eyes sliding like a snake from boy to boy. He poked at something between his teeth with his tongue. He had just opened his foul mouth to speak when the boy to Jonathan's right wobbled. The boy pinwheeled his arms to catch his balance, but it was too late, and he dropped off his block to the ground. The Admiral's mouth snapped shut, and he raised one of his cockroach eyebrows. He shook his head and clucked his tongue. "To the sorrow, Miguel Vargas." The boy's head dropped. "Yes, sir," he mumbled, and slouched to the sinner's sorrow. Its black wood dotted now with raindrops. He knelt on the horrible device and squinched his eyes shut. Jonathan remembered well the bite of that sharp rail. He bit his lip and looked away from Miguel. The Admiral watched him for a moment and then looked back to the boys still on the blocks. "Boys, we have a new student among us. As I am sure you know, a young Jonathan Grisby, 12 years old." As he talked, the Admiral strode slowly down the line of balancing boys. He stopped before Jonathan. 10 weeks we are supposed to have him. But for a crime of his magnitude, I think we may need him longer. Jonathan met the Admiral's sinister, gloating eyes for a second, then looked quickly away. The Admiral resumed walking down the line. "I thought it is a good idea this morning," he said, his voice booming so as to be heard from the rising wind and growing thunder, "to remind you all that you are what you are and why you are here, for Jonathan Grisby's benefit." At the end of the line, a boy's foot dropped to the ground. Without a word, he shook his head and walked to the sinner's sorrow. Miguel jumped gratefully up from the kneeler and limped stiffly back to his stone block. The new boy scowled and took his place on his knees. The Admiral waited for them each to get into place before continuing. By now he was back in the center of the line, and he took a step backward so he could throw his grisly gaze over all the charges. "Bloody, disgusting little scabbing boys," he said. He enunciated each word clearly and precisely. I'll do it again. "Bloody, disgusting little scabs, boys. That is what you are. The very scabs of civilized society." He smiled an ugly, pinched smile. then let it drop from his face. And why, you might ask, do I call you Scabs? He started walking again, his eyes up at the clouds and the occasional quick flickers of lightning. His voice lilted and rose like a schoolteacher's. Oh, I can do this. Scabs, as you know, are nasty little things. An otherwise healthy boy gets a wound, a disfigurement, and it begins to bleed. That wound, and it forms a dirty little scab. Good for nothing. Enough unhealthy nastiness and ugliness. Well, boys, it is our civilization itself that is sick. It is too tolerant, too soft. It is wounded, bleeding from its rottenness. And you, lads, are the scabs. The bad little bits that nobody wants. He stopped and cleared his throat. Scratched at his nose, looked at the line of boys with distaste. And so, society sends you here. Society picks you off like the little scabs that you are and flicks you out here to my island to try and turn you into something better. And if I can't, the Admiral lowered his chin and looked at them from under his eyebrows. Well, at least we keep you out of the way for a while, and we give you what you deserve. He raised his head again and trudged deliberately through them, between two boys. His elbow bumped one, not too gently, and the boy stumbled to the ground. He kicked at a puddle and took the second boy's place on the kneeler. When the Admiral's voice bellowed again, it was moving behind. So what can we do with you? Why are you all such incorrigible delinquents? It's simple. The Admiral paused dramatically. Weakness and rot. You've been spoiled, and now you are rotten and weak, and it's up to me to fix you. So at Slabhenge, we do not do what other schools do. We do not read stories. We do not talk about your feelings. We do not play with numbers or write tedious essays about what you did last summer. What you did last summer was get weak and rotten. What you do here is work. You work. And yes, sometimes you suffer. That, I'm afraid, is the cost of improvement. That is where strengths come from, boys. The Admiral's voice circled slowly around him until he was once again standing before them. The rain had picked up, and now it was a bit more than sprinkling. It dripped down Jonathan's face and off the brim of the Admiral's hat. The puddles were growing, swallowing the few blocks left between them. It was almost as dark as night, and flashes of lightning splashed the courtyard with wild shadows. We will work the weakness out of you. With a flourish, the Admiral yanked his sword out of its scabbard. It flashed bright silver in the dim, stormy light. We will cut all the rottenness out of your character if we can. We will certainly try. Just as society cut the rottenness out of itself by sending your worthless hides to Slabhenge, Slabhenge will cut the rottenness out of you. We will bleed the infection right out of you. The Admiral took a step backward toward the line of men, his eyes still on the boys. The boy on the Sinner's Sorrow whined piteously and rocked from one knee to the other. The Admiral looked at him and rolled his eyes. Oh, back to your block, you baby, he muttered, and the boy jumped up. I didn't exactly mutter. Back to the block, you baby, he muttered, and the boy jumped up and scrambled back onto his stone block. The Admiral backed up until he was again in line, shoulder to shoulder with the others in the puddle. He raised his sword and pointed it. This is important. He raised his sword and pointed it straight up at the coal black clouds that rumbled and flashed overhead. Work, he hollered, practically screaming out, heard over the gusts of crashes and wind. There was a tingling in the air, a buzzing, a sharp vibration. Suffering, discipline, you are dirty little scabs, you devils, and you've been sent to hell. As the Admiral spoke, the metal buttons on his jacket began to glow with a strange blue light. There was a crackling like a static all around, then a great blinding flash. A hot white bolt of lightning shot down from the black clouds and through the upheld sword of the Admiral's hand. Spidery lines of electricity surged and cracked through the crowd of adults. And in one blink of a bit of a second, the puddle at their feet burned to a hissing white, burst, and the world was split by a deafening cannon crack. Crack! The boys screamed and jumped and covered their faces, and Jonathan felt himself thrown off his block and onto his rear on the ground. Then all was still. Jonathan sat on the wet stone with his eyes squeezed shut and heard nothing. Bit by bit sounds came back. A fading rumble of thunder, the rain dripping on the walls and puddles of the prison. Gusts of wind whistling between the towers. Jonathan lowered his arms and blinked open his eyes. Two boys still stood on their blocks. The rest were on the ground like him. They were all looking at where the admiral and his men had been standing a moment before. The men were still there, but they all lay in a heap on the ground, perfectly still. Rain pattered softly on their coats, their boots, their bare hands. The air reeked of steam and burning and electricity and lightning. No one moved. Slowly, first one, then two, then all of them, the boys crept closer. Step by step, they formed a cautious half circle around the pile of grown-ups. No one got too close. There was the admiral, face down, his hat on the ground and the sword still in his hand. There was Mr. Warwick on his back, his eye open and gaping up at the storm. Is he? One of the boys started to say. There was a crack of thunder and they all jumped, but no one stepped away. They hardly noticed the rain pouring down around them. Oh man, are they dead? Walter, who finally managed to ask the questions they were all wondering. We need to check, the big kid named Tony said. How? Sebastian asked breathlessly. Collins took one step closer to the steaming bodies. Someone needs to check for a pulse. Sebastian nodded. Right. Do it, Colin. Me? I don't want. Just do it, Colin. You're closest. Colin stepped forward. He tiptoed toward the bodies. Like he was afraid they'd wake up. He shied away from Mr. Warwick's staring eyes and reached down toward the admiral. His hand stopped inches from the admiral's neck. Let's see. And looked at Sebastian with his eyes wide. Do it, Sebastian snapped. Colin tucked the corners of his mouth into a frown. Cringed and braced himself. He felt with his fingers past the admiral's collar, trying to find the neck, expecting the admiral to leap up at any moment with a furious roar. But there was no leaping, no fury, no roar. Colin stood motionless for a moment, his eyes on the ground and his mouth still frowning. And the fingers of one hand held to the soggy neck of the Admiral of Slabhedge. He's always feeling for his pulse in here. Let's see. Then he blinked and looked up at the boys gathered at the fearful distance around him. Heath, dead, Colin whispered. Dead ath a doornail. Quite a chapter, that. 10 after 9. I think it's kind of good to do the next one. What do you think? To see what happens next. What are they going to do? It's only a few pages. We could keep going. Before I do, I'm going to tell you what's behind me. The painting on the wall is by my sister. It's one of her first paintings she did a long time ago. Long time ago. She's a pretty decent artist. It's kind of a fantasy painting. She does like to do landscapes mostly. And this sign over here, It's a Wonderful Life. It was supposed to be given to my mother, but by accident, it was Christmas presents were mixed up, and it was given to me by my brother. I was supposed to give it to his mother, my mother, and He said, well, maybe this is the right place for it. And I think it was, actually. Um, and then this vase over here, it's, you see, it's tall vase here. It was a gift from me for Christmas. It was a family kind of an heirloom that I always liked. My brother had it, and they decided to give it to me, which is nice. I'm the youngest of three. My brother's 12 years older than me, and my sister's 6 years older than me. So I've got some nice siblings. Sister that's an artist and a scientist, a shrink, and a brother who's an engineer, and he's retired. My sister's still working. But anyway, and my lamp, my QVC purchase. All right. Well, anyway, back to the story. I digress. That's what they say when you don't you don't focus on what we're doing. But since we're in quarantine, I need to digress a little here. And then you see, you get a Groot over here. It was a gift I bought my husband when we went to Seattle last summer in the CVS store. I said, "Oh, I love it! I gotta get him." Anyway, so we just had an amazing, unbelievable thing happen in the book. What? A lightning storm eliminated all the evil people in charge. Hmm? Now what? This is exciting. Do you want to find out now? Shall we? Or shall we wait? Wish you could answer me. Okay. So anyway, chapter 6. A dark and dastardly scheme. Think about, what do you think? I think it's good to always think what's going to happen next. And if it's called a dark and dastardly scheme, what might that mean? Dark. You know what dark is. Huh? And dastardly. Dastardly. It's a good word, too. A lot of good words in this book. A lot of good words. I read books and I find a new word almost every day. I get excited. One word I found out a while back, avuncular, means like an uncle. Uncle's right in there. Uncle, avuncular, like an uncle. An uncle's a friendly, nice guy. Usually comes over the house and like your uncle. I wonder if they have a word for not. Avantler. Avant. Some people call your aunt. Your aunt. Your aunt. I call them my aunts. But anyway, then obsidian we had. Obsidian means black. Very black. It's like lava is obsidian. I think lava. Onyx is another word that you could probably use for black. Let's see. Onyx colored. These words really make you imagine that black, dark black. Not any kind of gray. This is real serious black. Okay. Anyway, let's go on. You know me. I can go on without reading. All right, here we go. There was a moment of silence. Jonathan heard someone gulp. Colin realized he was still touching the dead admiral and yanked his hand back and stood up straight. Are they all dead? Tony asked. Check 'em, Colin, Sebastian demanded. No way, Sebastian. I did mine. Somebody else turn. Else's turn. Colin hopped out from between the bodies and rejoined the group. Sebastian grunted in frustration. Fine. Tony, you check those two, he said, pointing at Mr. Warwick and another body. Benny, those two, and you, Johnny, or whatever, you do those ones. He pointed at Jonathan, then at Mr. Mongley and the man who'd bellowed out their names during muster. It's Jonathan and I. Whatever, just do it now. Jonathan could tell that arguing wasn't going to work. He wiped his hands on his pant legs and stepped forward. He checked the roll caller first. The man's eyes were closed, but his mouth was open. Steam was rising off his jacket. Jonathan pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck. His fingers were half numb from the cold. He pressed them in harder. It felt like touching a warm steak. He felt nothing. He waited quietly. Nothing. He looked up. Dead, he said, and stepped over to Mr. Mongley. He heard Tony and Benny reporting the same thing about their dead grown-ups. Without thinking or pausing, he shoved his fingers into Mongley's throat. He remembered the man's raspy, haunting breath. Raindrops were running down the old man's bald, flaky scalp. He heard his head was to the side, his eyes both open, staring at the distant gray wall. They were actually kind of beautiful shade of blue. Jonathan gritted his teeth and tried not to throw up. The man's neck was still and pulseless. Mr. Mongley's dead, too. He remembered the night before and he whispered conversation with Walter before the bucket. Mongley hears everything, Walter had said. He looked up at Walter. Well, Jonathan said hoarsely, he's not hearing anything now. Well, Walter, Adam's apple bobbed in a dry swallow. Maybe he's hearing the choir of angels singing, Colin offered. Walter's eyes were still as that on the dead man. He shook his head and frowned. I seriously doubt that, man. Jonathan straightened up and stepped back into the quiet, watching circle. All the grown-ups are dead, Tony said in a hollow, wondering voice. Is this all of them? Jonathan asked, his voice rising. There's no one else inside? A janitor or a guard or something? Walter shook his head. It was morning muster. This is all the grown-ups, man. The whole Slabhen staff. Why'd they all die? Miguel asked. The Admiral was holding that sword, Jonathan said. They were all touching, Sebastian added. Standing in that puddle, Colin finished. Tony sniffed and looked back at the stone blocks they'd been balancing on when the lightning struck. We were on the blocks, up from the puddles, he said in a trembling voice. We'd all be dead too if we'd been standing on the ground. Jonathan looked up at Mr. Warwick's one glassy dead eye staring sightlessly up at the storm clouds, which we weren't. Thank the devil, he whispered. There was a sudden gusting blast of wind that whipped their hair and clothes around. The thunder cracked, and the somber scene of wet children looking at a pile of dead bodies was lit by a long flash of lightning. The rain doubled in strength, rolling up to a real downpour. Suddenly they each seemed to realize that they themselves were now standing together in a puddle, with the lightning flashing. One by one, then, all at once, without saying anything, they scurried over to the cover of a big gated doorway that led out to the boat landing. It was cold in the shadows of the stone archway, but it was out of the wind and rain, and more important, the bolts of lightning that darted across the sky. They huddled together in the near darkness, looking out at the corpses getting soggy in the courtyard. A couple of the smaller kids, were crying, not because they were sad, Jonathan thought, just scared. We're in so much trouble, Benny said. What? Sebastian's voice was harsh and scornful. What for? We didn't do anything. Still, Miguel said. How? Here we are, you know. Us. The scabs and all that. And all the grown-ups end up dead? I mean, my folks sent me here for skipping school a few times, you know. I'm definitely going to get grounded for at least a week for this when I get home. This last word hung in the air between them. The wind couldn't blow it away. Home. It dawned on them at the same time. We get to go home, Walter said quietly. We get to go home, Walter said quietly. We get to go home, another kid echoed. We get to go home, 2 or 3 kids cried. Someone cheered, a few kids clapped. Jonathan bit his bottom lip and frowned. Sebastian crackled his knuckles and furrowed his brow. When do we go? Tony asked. Can we call now? The police? There's no telephone, idiot, Sebastian said under his breath. He turned his head so that everyone could hear him. There's no telephone, remember? No one's going home yet. He looked at the bodies. His eyes narrowed and he said it again more quietly. No one's going home yet. They all looked at Benny. Well, when can we go? Tony asked again. When's the next boat coming? You worked in the office, Benny. You know the schedule best, a tall, skinny kid with red hair said. Jonathan remembered from morning muster that his name was Gerald. Benny still had his eyes glued to his boss's body. He shook his head. Well, today's Tuesday, right? There's no food drop-off or garbage pickup till Thursday. No new students are registered to come that I know of. So today would just be Patrick coming on the mail run. When's that? Just before lunch, usually, like 10:30. All right, Walter said, a couple hours, that's it. Then we tell that mail guy what happened, and he sends a bigger boat out, and then we're all out of here. A couple boys clapped again. There were a few seconds of nothing but the sound of rain. One kid leaned against a stone wall, another coughed. So, what should we do? Miguel asked. Should we get them out of the rain? Colin asked. Jonathan's brain was working. He was looking at all the dead grown-ups and frowning and thinking of home and family and everything that had happened to bring him here to the island of Slabhen. A small, ugly, beautiful idea was wiggling in his mind. His stomach rumbled, wanting more than a meager bowl of oatmeal. It was hard to hatch a dark and dastardly scheme on an empty stomach. I think we should eat, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm starving. Sebastian's brow was still creased with dark, thoughtful lines. Yeah, he said, I'm with the new kid. Let's go eat. Then his face smoothed into a grinning smile and he cocked an eyebrow back at the huddled boys. Whatever we want. One kid clapped, but just one. Most of the boys had probably lost their appetites when they watched all the adults get struck and killed by lightning. But Sebastian started off across the rain-drenched courtyard toward the kitchen door. Jonathan stepped after him. All the rest slowly followed close behind. The straggling line of somber, soaked boys snaked right past the lifeless bodies, staring up at the storm. The kitchen was noisy with cooking, but there was not much talking. Mouths were too full for talking most of the time. Tony stirred a pan of 10 scrambled eggs. Jonathan didn't think he planned on sharing. Benny was eating jelly out of this jar with a spoon. Sebastian was shoving a banana in his mouth while frying up 6 pieces of bacon. The 2 big brutes, Roger and Dreary, Jonathan remembered, were eating pepperoni slices by the handful, greasy grins on their faces. The little black-haired kid named Jason sat on the floor in the walk-in fridge and gnawed on brick-sized blocks of cheddar cheese. Most of the boys just stood around eating in the kitchen. I'm thinking about the cat right now. Callie, kitty, 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 kitty. She's sleeping. She's in her sleeping mode. Jonathan made himself 2 gooey peanut butter and jelly sandwich and joined them, sitting across from Colin and Walter. Another kid sat next to him, a little taller than him, with glasses and short curly hair. Francis, right? Jonathan asked through a mouthful of peanut butter and jelly. Yes, and you're Jonathan, our newest arrival. Francis held out his hand and Jonathan blinked at him for a second before reaching out and shaking it. Francis had a slight accent, but not a foreign one. He pronounced all of his syllables very precisely. To Jonathan, he sounded like the rich people on TV. Looks like your stay here has been cut quite short. Jonathan said, chewing. Guess so. And what terrible wrong did you commit to deserve being here? Francis asked. He was being sarcastic. Jonathan could tell, but he still flinched. He swallowed his bite. What did you do? He asked back. What did you do? This is Jonathan asking Francis. And what terrible wrong did you commit to deserve being sent here? Francis asked. He was being sarcastic. Oh yeah, Francis, there we go. What did you do? He asked back across the table. Colin frowned and took another bite of his apple. Oh, hardly anything, really, Francis answered in a bored voice. I pushed our gardener off the ladder. Honestly, if he hadn't broken his hip, there wouldn't even have been charges. Was it an accident? Francis shrugged. No. Why did you do it? Francis rolled his eyes. Does it really matter? I guess not. Francis sighed. Yes. Well, my father got a top-notch attorney, really quite expensive by the whole thing, but the whole thing happened at our summer house, and all the local townspeople were quite up in arms about it, really screaming for blood. Tried to make it all into some ridiculous wealth class issue. So here I am, eating white bread. The damned country judge sent me here. That's a terrible thing to do, Colin said. Yes, well, the judge's hands were really quite tied, I'm afraid. It's an elected office. He had to give the people what they wanted. I meant it was a terrible thing to do to the gardener. Oh, Francis sniffed. Well, it didn't end well for me either, as you see. They all chewed in silence for a while. How does the refrigerator work? Jonathan asked. Everyone stopped chewing and looked at him. I mean, there doesn't seem to be electricity here. It's all torches and candles. What's running the fridge and freezer? Walter scraped a piece of jelly bean out from between his teeth and looked at it, stuck to his finger. Oh, there's electricity. There's a coal generator downstairs that we all get to take turns shoveling coal into. Makes just enough juice to run the fridge, freezer, and the Admiral's TV. Oh, Jonathan swallowed the last bite of his second sandwich and considered going to make another one. And the freezer's big, too, like the fridge? Walter nodded. Yeah, a little smaller, I guess, but still a walk-in. Why, man? Jonathan shook his head. No reason, just wondering. But Jonathan's head was still buzzing with dark dreams. And he did have a reason for asking about the freezer. 8 reasons, in fact. The 16 students of the Slabheads Reformatory for Troubled Boys stood at the gate, looking out the white-capped waves of the ocean. Somewhere out there across the sea was the mainland and home. Home. With meals, parents, beds, a happy place for most of them. Sebastian had crept up and unclipped the key from Mr. Vander's belt, and they opened the heavy wooden door to the outside. They stood in the shadow of the stone arch, looking out at the water and waiting for the boat. The 8 bodies still lay in the drizzling rain behind them. They leaned with their hands holding the rusty iron bars. Some of them still chewed on crusty bread or chunks of cheese. How much longer? A kid asked. I told you, any minute, Benny answered. What should we say? What do you mean, what should we say? All the grown-ups got killed by lightning and we want to go home, dummy. The rain was just a constant, gentle tapping now. The thunder and lightning were gone, but the clouds were still night black and the world was dim and dark. Then, thin and lost, somewhere beneath the sound of the waves smacking the stone walls, there came a buzzing sound, like a fly caught between the window and the screens. There, Miguel called out, his voice excited. There, I see it, he pointed. The other boys, yeah, I see it. There it is. The boat was a dot, still far distant, fighting its way through the wind and the waves. To bring them back to the real world. Jonathan chewed on the inside of his cheek. He looked at Sebastian, leaning in the corner where the gate met the stone wall. Sebastian was the only one besides him who wasn't smiling. His scowl was as grim as the deadly clouds, his eyes as full of dark thoughts as Jonathan's. Their eyes met. Jonathan thought he saw a wet glimmer of tears in Sebastian's eyes before they looked away from his. All the boys' voices fell silent as they watched the little boat make its way toward their gloomy island. Jonathan took one deep breath and then spoke, his voice in silence. Maybe we shouldn't go. Head snapped his way. Sebastian's sour face turned sharply toward him. What? Walter asked. Maybe we shouldn't go, Jonathan repeated. Maybe we shouldn't tell what happened. Yet. Sebastian's eyes stayed locked on his eyes clenched. Jonathan cocked a questioning eyebrow at him, and then Sebastian nodded. What are you talking about? A kid asked. Jonathan raised his voice and put some strength into it. I'm talking about staying. Without the grown-ups. Without any grown-ups. I'm talking about all of us staying here at Stabhenge alone. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to stop. So we found out what happened, and now they're here, and they're going to take charge of this business alone for a while and see what happens. Interesting, right? Next time we read, we'll be reading chapter 7. It's called Dead Man's Coat. Dead Man's Coat. Okay, well, that's something for you to think about. What will they do? What will happen? Will they start a band? The Slabhenge band? I know. I read it. And we'll continue to read it as time allows. And I'll say goodbye for now until we meet again. I hope you're enjoying it. Tell your friends if you're on email or whatever with each other. Read it. Listen to Miss Beth read the book. I want to hear that you're enjoying it. I like to hear from you what you think about it. Maybe you don't share my opinion of the book, and you don't have to. I won't make you kneel down on the sinner's sorrow if you don't like it, but you better like it. Bye.